The blizzard didn't just bring snow to the Dakota Territory in '77, it brought a reckoning. For Adeline Hobbs, a widow with nothing but a starving son, and the dust-caked dress on her back, that reckoning had a name: Jedediah Kane. He was the only man in the raw, unforgiving town of Redemption with a full larder and a sturdy roof, and he offered it all to her. Shelter from the killing frost food, for her boy a fire in the hearth. But his price wasn't paid in coin or labor. It was paid in the silent surrender of her body and soul. She thought she was making a bargain to save her son's life, but she never imagined that true salvation would come not from the town's cruelest patriarch, but from his most silent, watchful servant. The wind had teeth. It was a living thing in the autumn of 1877, a predator that gnawed at the seams of Adeline Hobbs's threadbare coat and stole the warmth from her son's small hands. It howled down the single muddy street of Redemption, a town whose name felt like a bitter joke. There was no redemption here, only survival. And for Adeline and 7-year-old Thomas, survival was a currency they had nearly exhausted. Her husband, Walter, a man full of gentle smiles and foolish dreams of gold, had coughed his last breath into the unforgiving Dakota soil 2 months prior. The fever had taken him swiftly, leaving Adeline with a half-built sod house, a lame mule, and a heart hollowed out by grief and fear. The mule had been the first to go traded for a sack of flour and a few pounds of salted pork that were now little more than a memory. The sod house, their pathetic claim against the vast, indifferent prairie, was already succumbing to the elements its roof, leaking a slurry of mud and despair with every rain. Now the first whispers of winter were turning into a full-throated roar. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, heavy and low. Every soul in Redemption knew what was coming. They called it a she-wolf winter, the kind that buried cattle where they stood and froze a man solid between his front door and the woodpile. The townsfolk, a hard-bitten collection of prospectors, ranchers, and merchants, had turned their faces away from her. A widow with a child was a drainer mouth to feed, with no strong back to earn its keep. Mrs. Gable at the general store had stopped offering credit her eyes as cold and flat as coins. Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority was measured in the heft of his gut and the shine on his badge, had simply grunted and told her, "Pray for an early spring, ma'am." Prayer felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. Thomas's cough was getting worse. It was a dry, rattling sound that echoed the rustle of dead leaves skittering across the frozen ground. His face, once round and ruddy, was now pale, and pinched his eyes too large for his thinning frame. He huddled against her, his small body, a fragile shield against the cold, and whispered, "I'm hungry, Mama." Those 3 words broke what little was left of her resolve. They were the final push over a cliff she'd been clinging to for weeks. Her gaze drifted to the edge of town, to the only 2-story timber house in Redemption. It was a fortress of prosperity, with glass windows that glowed with warm lamplight, and a stone chimney that puffed a steady, arrogant plume of smoke into the bruised sky. Jedediah Kane's house. Kane owned the saloon, the freight company, and the mortgage on half the businesses in town. He was a man built of sinew and quiet menace, with eyes the color of a winter river full of dark currents. He had arrived a decade ago with nothing, and had carved out an empire through shrewd deals and ruthless foreclosure. He was unmarried, childless, and lived alone, save for a few hired hands. One of them was a Lakota man, a solitary figure Adeline had seen, mending fences or stacking wood, always on the periphery, his face a mask of stoic indifference. Kane had made his interest in Adeline clear weeks ago, shortly after Walter's passing. He hadn't offered condolences. He had offered a proposition, his voice low and smooth, but with an edge like a newly sharpened knife. "A woman like you, Mrs. Hobbs, a fine woman. It's a waste to see you struggle. A woman needs a protector, a provider." His meaning was as clear as the glass in his windows. She had recoiled. Then Walter's memory, still a fresh, aching wound. She had her pride, her dignity. But pride didn't fill a hungry belly. Dignity didn't stop a child's shivering. Now, as the first snowflakes began to spin in the air, sharp and icy, her pride felt like a foolish, flimsy thing. She looked at Thomas at the blue tint to his lips and knew she had no choice left. She was a mother before she was a woman of honor. She was a protector, and she would use the only weapon she had left herself. Straightening her thin shoulders, she took Thomas's hand. His small fingers were like ice in hers. "Come, my love," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We're going to get warm. We're going to get something to eat." She didn't walk. She marched. Each step toward Jedediah Kane's house was a footfall on the grave of the woman she used to be. The townsfolk watched from their windows as she passed, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They knew where she was going, they knew why, and in their silence, they were all complicit. She knocked on the heavy oak door. It felt like striking a bargain with the devil himself. The door opened, and Kane stood there, silhouetted against the warm light within. He wasn't a large man, but he filled the doorway completely. He looked down at her, then at the boy, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of kindness, but of ownership. "Mrs. Hobbs," he said, his voice a low purr of satisfaction. "I was wondering when you'd come to your senses. The wind is biting tonight. Please come in. Come into the warmth." Adeline stepped over the threshold, pulling Thomas with her. The heavy door closed behind them with a solid, final thud. It sounded like the world being shut out, or a cage door swinging closed. The warmth inside Jedediah Kane's house was a physical shock. It was a thick, oppressive heat that smelled of roasted meat, pipe tobacco, and something else, the dry, sterile scent of a place without love. A fire roared in a massive stone hearth, its flames casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls. The furniture was dark, heavy, and expensive, polished to a gleam that reflected Adeline's own haggard image back at her. It was a beautiful prison. Kane led them to the dining table, where a half-eaten leg of mutton sat cooling. Without a word to her, he gestured to a chair for Thomas. "Boy, sit. Eat." Thomas looked at Adeline, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and ravenous hunger. She gave him a slight nod, a silent permission that felt like a betrayal. He scrambled onto the chair and began tearing at the meat with his hands, his small face a mask of desperate focus. Adeline's stomach clenched, but she felt no hunger herself, only a spreading icy numbness. Kane watched the boy for a long moment, a flicker of something amusement, perhaps contempt in his eyes. Then he turned his gaze to Adeline. He walked a slow circle around her, like a rancher inspecting new livestock. "You've made a wise decision, Adeline. I can call you Adeline now. Can't I? Walter is gone. You're under my roof now." His hand came up and brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was dry and cool, proprietary. She flinched but forced herself to stand still. "There are rules in my house," he continued, his voice dropping. "You will keep it clean. You will prepare my meals, and you will warm my bed. In return, your boy will have a full belly, and you will both have this roof over your heads. It is a simple arrangement. Do you understand it?" "I understand," she whispered, her voice a reedy thing. "Good." He seemed satisfied. "There's a room upstairs, second on the left. It will be yours, for you and the boy. For now." The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Life in Kane's house settled into a grim routine. Adeline became a ghost, moving through the polished rooms, scrubbing, cooking, mending. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles were raw, polished silver, until her own reflection was a blur, and cooked meals she could barely stomach. Kane was a creature of habit and control. He wanted his breakfast at dawn, his supper at dusk, his whiskey poured just so. He rarely spoke to her during the day, but his presence was a constant weight, his eyes following her every move. The nights were the worst. She would lie beside him in the dark, her body rigid, enduring his cold, methodical touch, her mind 1,000 miles away, repeating Thomas's name like a prayer. Her only solace was her son. For him, the house was a miracle. He had food warmth and a proper bed for the first time in months. The color returned to his cheeks, and the hollows under his eyes filled out. He was too young to understand the true cost of their comfort, and Adeline guarded his innocence with a fierce, silent desperation. It was during her second week that she truly noticed the other silent inhabitant of the property, the Lakota man. His name, she learned from Kane's dismissive orders, was Wanbli. Just Wanbli. Kane never used a surname, as if the man didn't deserve one. Wanbli was responsible for all the outdoor work. He chopped the endless supply of firewood, tended to Kane's 2 horses, repaired whatever broke, and did it all with an economy of motion that was almost mesmerizing. He was tall and lean, with a braid of thick black hair that hung down his back. His face was a landscape of sharp angles and quiet sorrow, his eyes dark and deep-set. He moved with a noiseless grace that was at odds with the brutal labor he performed. He never spoke. Adeline wasn't even sure if he could speak English. Kane treated him like a piece of equipment, barking orders and tossing him scraps of food from the back door, as if he were a stray dog. Yet Wanbli endured it all with an unreadable stoicism. His gaze never met hers directly, but she felt it sometimes, a quick assessing glance as she hung laundry or swept the porch. It wasn't leering like the looks she got from men in town. It was something else. A flicker of recognition, perhaps. 2 prisoners acknowledging each other across the prison yard. One afternoon, as a fresh squall of snow began to fall, Adeline was watching Thomas play near the woodpile. He was trying to build a small fort with the irregular pieces of chopped wood. A log tumbled, catching his small hand against another. He cried out a sharp yelp of pain. Adeline rushed out, her heart pounding. Before she could reach him, Wanbli was there. He had been splitting logs on the other side of the pile, and he moved with the swiftness of a striking hawk. He knelt beside Thomas, murmuring something in his own language, his voice a low rumbling sound. It wasn't harsh or frightening. It was surprisingly gentle. He took Thomas's hand, his large, calloused fingers incredibly delicate, as he examined the boy's bruised knuckles. Thomas, who was usually shy around strangers, had stopped crying and was staring at the Lakota man with wide, curious eyes. Wanbli looked up, and for the first time, his eyes met Adeline's directly. In their depths, she saw none of the cold indifference she had expected. She saw exhaustion, a profound sadness, and something else, a spark of empathy that cut through her numbness. He gave a short, sharp nod as if to say, "He will be fine." Then he turned, selected a perfectly smooth, bird-shaped piece of kindling from the pile, and pressed it into Thomas's uninjured hand. He stood, turned his back, and resumed his work as if nothing had happened. Adeline knelt and pulled her son close, her eyes fixed on the powerful swing of Wanbli's axe. Kane had given her shelter. Kane fed her child. But in that brief, silent moment, this nameless, voiceless man had shown her the first act of genuine kindness she had received since Walter died. And it felt more warming than the fire roaring in Jedediah Kane's gilded cage. The weeks bled into one another each day, a mirror of the last. The snow fell deep and relentless, burying redemption under a blanket of white and isolating them completely. Adeline's world shrank to the dimensions of Kane's house and the small yard surrounding it. Inside was Kane's suffocating control. Outside was Wanbley's silent labor. She existed in the space between. Her interactions with Wanbley became a quiet, unspoken dialogue. It was a language composed of small gestures of things left unsaid. When she hung the laundry on the line, she would find the path to the woodpile had been cleared of the deepest snow, though Kane had never ordered it. When she took the scraps out for him after dinner, a task that shamed her, but which she did with as much dignity as she could muster, placing the plate on the porch rail instead of tossing it, she sometimes returned to find a small, intricately woven star of dried grass left in its place. She knew it was from him. Thomas, with the unburdened innocence of a child, was less reticent. He was fascinated by Wanbley. He would stand at the window for long stretches, watching the Lakota warrior work. The small bird-shaped piece of kindling Wanbley had given him became his most treasured possession. He slept with it under his pillow. One morning, Thomas bundled himself up and marched outside while Wanbley was sharpening an axe blade. He stood a few feet away, a small, determined figure in the vast whiteness. Adeline watched from the kitchen window, her heart in her throat, ready to run out and snatch him back. Wanbley stopped his work. He didn't look at the boy, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Thomas held up the wooden bird. "It's a good bird," he said, his small voice carrying on the crisp air. Wanbley remained silent, his attention fixed on the whetstone. "My pa used to carve," Thomas added, undeterred. "He wasn't very good. His horses always looked like dogs." A small, almost imperceptible tremor went through Wanbley's shoulders. It might have been a shiver from the cold, or it might have been a suppressed laugh. He slowly turned his head and looked at Thomas. He gave the boy a single solemn nod. Then he returned to his work. It was the longest conversation they ever had, and it was a turning point. From then on, a fragile trust began to form. Thomas would sometimes sit on the porch steps, chattering away to Wanbley's silent working back, telling him about his father, about the dreams he had, about the way the snow looked on the pine trees. And Wanbley, in his silence, listened. Adeline knew he did. This silent understanding did not go unnoticed by Jedediah Kane. His eyes missed nothing. He began to watch Adeline with a new, venomous suspicion. "You seem to have a fondness for my hired help," he said one evening, his voice deceptively casual as he cleaned his pistol at the dining table. Adeline, who was darning one of his socks, didn't look up. "He is quiet and does his work. He's a savage, Adeline, a red skin, barely a man. Remember that?" Kane sneered. "They're like animals. You show them an ounce of kindness, and they'll take it as a sign of weakness. They'll bite the hand that feeds them." His words were a warning, sharp and clear. He started creating tasks to drive a wedge between them. He would order Adeline to clear the porch at the exact time he knew Wanbley would be walking by with firewood, forcing the Lakota to detour through the deep snow. He would accidentally spill a bucket of ash where Adeline had just swept, then bellow for Wanbley to clean up her mess. They were petty cruelties designed to humiliate them both, to remind them of their places in his world. The tension in the house grew taut, like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Adeline could feel Kane's jealousy coiling around her, possessive and cold. He began to touch her more in the daylight hours, a hand on her waist, as she cooked fingers gripping her arm, as she passed small acts of ownership meant for an audience of one. One frigid afternoon, Cain returned from town early, his face flushed with whiskey. He saw Thomas sitting on the porch steps, showing Wanbley the intricate frost patterns on a window pane he'd carried outside. Wanbley was actually looking at it. His head tilted, a rare expression of interest on his face. Cain's face contorted with rage. He stormed onto the porch, grabbing the shard of glass from Thomas's hand and hurling it into a snowbank. "Get inside, boy!" he roared. Thomas scrambled away, terrified. Cain turned on Wanbley, his voice dripping with venom. "What do you think you're doing, you filthy animal? Tainting my property, talking to my boy?" Wanbley stood slowly, his face reverting to its familiar stoic mask, but his eyes were like chips of obsidian. He said nothing. "I pay you to work, not to fraternize," Cain spat, poking a stiff finger into Wanbley's chest. "You are less than the dirt on my boots. You will not look at her. You will not look at the boy. You will look at the ground. Do you understand me?" Wanbley's gaze remained locked on Cain's face, unwavering. For a terrifying second, Adeline thought he would strike back. She saw a muscle jump in his jaw, the sheer force of his willpower, the restraint it took to stand there and absorb the venomous tirade was a palpable thing. Finally, slowly, Wanbley lowered his eyes to the snow-covered planks of the porch. Satisfied, Cain grunted and shoved past him, storming into the house. Adeline, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Cain's cruelty hadn't driven them apart. It had done the opposite. It had shown her the depth of Wanbley's strength, a strength far greater than Cain's loud bullying brand of power. It was the strength of silent endurance, of a spirit that refused to be broken. And in that moment, her quiet respect for the lonely Lakota warrior began to blossom into something far more dangerous. The she-wolf winter tightened its grip. For 2 weeks the snow fell without pause, sealing redemption from the outside world, as surely as if a wall had been built around it. The wind shrieked a constant, maddening lament. It was during this endless white siege that Thomas fell ill. It started with a cough, deeper and more ragged than before. Then came the fever. His skin burned to the touch, his cheeks flushed a frightening mottled red, and his breaths came in shallow, rasping gasps. Adeline was plunged into a cold terror that eclipsed everything else. She tried all the remedies she knew, cool cloths on his forehead, willow bark, tea broth he was too weak to swallow. Nothing worked. The fever climbed, and he began to drift in and out of a delirious sleep, murmuring his father's name. She begged Cain to fetch the town doctor, a drunken old man named Peterson. "In this," Cain scoffed, gesturing to the blizzard raging outside the window. "Don't be a fool, woman. The boy has a chill. He's weak like his father. He'll either fight it off or he won't. Wasting my time and risking my neck for a whelp's cough is not part of our arrangement." His callousness was a physical blow. Adeline stared at him, the illusion of her bargain shattering completely. She had traded herself for her son's safety, but she saw now that Cain's protection was conditional, his generosity a sham. Thomas's life meant nothing to him, beyond being a tool to control her. Desperation clawed at her throat. She sat by Thomas's bedside for 2 days and nights, watching helplessly as the life flickered in him like a guttering candle flame. On the 3rd morning, he was barely responsive. His breathing was so faint, she had to put her ear to his lips to feel it. As she stumbled into the kitchen at dawn to boil more water, her body trembling with exhaustion and grief, she saw him. Wanbley was standing by the back door, a dark silhouette against the swirling white outside. He shouldn't have been there. The storm was too fierce for even him to work. He held a bundle of something in his arms. He met her eyes, and his gaze was filled with an intensity that startled her. He gave a short, sharp jerk of his head toward the door. It was an invitation, a command. With nothing left to lose, she threw a shawl over her shoulders and slipped outside into the biting cold. He led her not to the woodpile, but to the small, sheltered stable where Cain kept his horses. The air inside was warmer, thick with the scent of hay and animal life. He lit a small lantern, and in its flickering glow, he unrolled his bundle onto a clean patch of hay. Inside were roots, dried leaves, and strips of bark she didn't recognize. He pointed to the bundle, then tapped his own chest, then pointed toward the house where Thomas lay. The message was clear. This is medicine. For the boy. He began to work his hands, sure and swift. He used a sharp stone to crush some of the leaves into a powder, and a knife to shave slivers from a dark, gnarled root. He gestured for the kettle of hot water she had instinctively brought with her. For the first time, he spoke to her, his voice low and raspy from disuse. But the English words were clear, if heavily accented. "My people, use these for lung fire," he said, holding up a pale, silvery leaf. He must drink. And this, he held up a strip of reddish bark, on the chest, to draw the heat. Adeline stared at him, her mind reeling. "You speak English." A shadow passed over his face. Enough. He didn't elaborate. The single word carried a world of pain, a history she couldn't begin to imagine. It spoke of forced assimilation, of loss of a past. He kept locked away. "Why are you helping me?" She whispered the question raw with a week's worth of unshed tears. He paused in his work, his dark eyes finding hers in the lantern light. "The boy, he has a strong spirit," Wanbley said. He glanced away toward the stable wall as if looking through it to a place far away. "I had a son. His spirit flies with the eagles now." The confession was stark, unadorned, and it struck Adeline with the force of a physical blow. In that moment, he was no longer the silent savage Cain described. He was a man, a father, who had known a grief that mirrored her own deepest fear. An unspoken bond of shared humanity formed between them in the quiet warmth of the stable. She took the poultice and the tea. He prepared her heart, hammering with a terrifying mixture of hope and fear. This was a wild, desperate gamble. Using native medicine was seen as witchcraft by some, and if Cain found out, his fury would be unimaginable. But looking at Wanbley's solemn, steady face, she found a trust that the town's so-called doctor could never inspire. Back in the room, she gently roused Thomas. She coaxed the warm, bitter tea between his lips and spread the warm, aromatic paste on his small, feverish chest. For hours, nothing changed. Adeline sat vigil, praying to a god she was no longer sure she believed in. Sometime near midnight, she felt a change. The ferocious heat of Thomas's skin seemed to lessen. He stirred, and a film of sweat broke on his forehead. His breathing, while still shallow, lost its ragged, rasping edge. By morning, the fever had broken. He was weak, exhausted, but he was breathing steadily, and his eyes, when he opened them, were clear. Adeline collapsed onto the floor beside his bed, her body shaking with convulsive sobs of pure, unadulterated relief. Later that day, she saw Wanbley from the window, clearing a path through the new-fallen snow. She opened the kitchen door just a crack. The cold air rushed in. "Thank you," she called out, her voice thick with emotion. He stopped his work, but did not turn. He stood motionless for a long moment, a solitary figure in a world of white. Then he raised his hand and touched his heart. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of a shared secret, of a debt that could never be spoken of. She had placed her son's life in his hands, and he had not failed her. The foundation of their relationship had shifted from one of silent sympathy to a bond forged in desperation and sealed with trust. Thomas's recovery was slow but steady. As strength returned to his small body, a new defiant energy began to spark within Adeline. Wanbley's actions had done more than save her son. They had reawakened a part of her she thought had died with Walter, her will, her fight. The icy numbness that had encased her heart began to thaw, replaced by a slow-burning anger. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance, but a woman who had been shown a profound kindness in the face of absolute cruelty. Her demeanor toward Cain changed subtly. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but it was now overlaid with a quiet contempt. Her movements were just as efficient, her cooking just as precise, but the deference was gone from her eyes. She no longer flinched from his gaze, but met it with a cool, level stare that he could not quite decipher. Cain, ever perceptive to shifts in power, felt the change. Her newfound resilience, her unbroken spirit infuriated him. She was his possession, and his possessions were not supposed to have a will of their own. His suspicion, which had been a simmering coal, now ignited. He was certain the Lakota was the source of this defiance. He began to look for proof, his eyes darting around the house, searching for any sign of their collusion. He found it a few days later. While searching Thomas's room under the guise of ensuring the boy's comfort, his hand brushed against something hard under the pillow. He pulled it out. It was the small bird-shaped piece of kindling Wanbley had carved. To Cain it was not a child's toy. It was a token, a symbol of a secret allegiance, a brand of ownership that was not his own. Adeline was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the evening's bread, when he stormed in. He slammed the wooden bird down on the floured countertop. It landed with a sharp crack, sending a puff of white into the air. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Adeline's blood ran cold. "It's Thomas's. A toy." "A toy from who?" he sneered, already knowing the answer. "From him. From the savage. You let him give things to my boy. You let his filth into my house." "It was a harmless gift," she said, her voice trembling slightly. But she held his gaze. "A kindness." "Kindness." Cain laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Let me show you the kind of kindness a savage understands." He grabbed his heavy coat and strode out the back door. Adeline flew to the window, her heart seizing with terror. Wanbley was splitting logs his back to the house, the rhythmic thud of his axe, the only sound in the frozen air. Cain marched across the snow-covered yard. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He walked with a cold, deliberate purpose that was far more frightening. When he reached Wanbley, he kicked the chopping block, sending a half-split log tumbling. Wanbley straightened slowly, turning to face him. His expression was unreadable. "I told you not to look at them," Cain said, his voice carrying clearly to the house. "I told you not to speak to them." He didn't wait for a reply. He swung his fist, connecting with Wanbley's jaw in a sickening crack of bone against bone. The force of the blow snapped Wanbley's head to the side, but he did not fall. He simply stood there, absorbing the impact, a thin trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't flinch away. He just stood, his eyes locked on Cain, a silent monument of defiance. This passivity seemed to enrage Cain even more. He hit him again and again, brutally, methodically putting his full weight into each blow. Inside the house, Adeline screamed. She threw the door open and ran out onto the porch, heedless of the cold. "Stop it! Jedediah, stop! You'll kill him!" Cain paused, his chest heaving. He turned to look at her, a wild, triumphant light in his eyes. This is what happens to animals who don't learn their place. This is what happens when you defy me. He turned back to Wanbli, who was now swaying on his feet, his face a mask of blood. Cain drew back his fist for another blow, but this time something changed. As Cain's arm swung forward, he let out a choked cry and lunged not at Wanbli, but toward Adeline. "And you!" he roared, his rage now completely unhinged. "You will learn your lesson too." It was the breaking point. The threat to her, after the threat to the boy, after the brutalization of the man who had saved them both, was too much. As Cain's hand reached for her, Wanbli moved. It wasn't a wild swing or a desperate tackle. It was a movement of pure economic power. He stepped forward, his body flowing with a speed that seemed impossible. He didn't strike with his fist. He used his open palm, striking Cain's chest with a sharp, explosive force. At the same time, his leg swept out, hooking Cain's ankle. Cain went down as if struck by lightning. He landed hard on his back in the snow, the air rushing from his lungs in a pained gasp. He lay there stunned and gasping like a landed fish. Wanbli stood over him, his chest rising and falling, blood dripping from his chin onto the pristine snow. He had not killed him. He had not even truly injured him. He had simply stopped him. He had demonstrated a strength and control that made Cain's brutish violence look pathetic and clumsy. The standoff was absolute. Wanbli, the battered warrior. Cain, the master of the house, humbled in the snow. And Adeline standing on the porch, a witness to the final irrevocable shattering of their fragile world. Wanbli slowly turned his head, his swollen eyes finding hers. The message in them was stark and immediate. "We have to go. Now." He turned and strode toward the stable without a backward glance. The spell was broken. Adeline ran back into the house, her mind a maelstrom. She grabbed Thomas, who was crying in a corner, wrapped him in the thickest blanket she could find, and stuffed a loaf of bread and a block of cheese into a sack. She took nothing else. Nothing in this house was hers. When she emerged, Wanbli was leading one of Cain's horses, a sturdy gelding from the stable. It was saddled, and a heavy buffalo robe was tied behind it. He helped her mount, then swung Thomas up in front of her. He handed her the reins. "Ride north," he said, his voice thick from his split lip. "Follow the creek. Do not stop." "What about you?" she cried, her voice frantic. He was already turning away, grabbing a rifle from a sheath on the stable wall. "I will slow him down. I will find you." Before she could protest, he slapped the horse's rump. The animal bolted, carrying her and her son away from the house, away from redemption, and out into the vast, unforgiving, and blessedly empty wilderness. The world beyond Cain's property was a maelstrom of white. The wind drove the snow into a blinding horizontal curtain, stinging Adeline's face and stealing the air from her lungs. She wrapped one arm around Thomas, holding him tight against her chest, and clutched the reins with the other, her knuckles already numb. Wanbli's instructions echoed in her mind. "Ride north. Follow the creek. Do not stop." Fear was a wild animal, clawing at her insides. Fear of the blizzard, of the endless, featureless landscape, and most of all, fear of Jedediah Cain. She imagined him rising from the snow, his face contorted in a mask of vengeful fury. He was not a man who suffered humiliation. He would come for them. He had trackers, men in his pocket, who would hunt them for a bottle of whiskey and a handful of coins. They were not just fleeing, they were being hunted. The horse, a powerful animal named Silas, was their only hope. He plunged through the drifts with a steady, desperate rhythm, his warm breath pluming in the frigid air. Adeline bent low over Thomas, trying to shield him with her own body, whispering reassurances she did not feel herself. The creek was a faint, dark line in the snow, a frozen artery guiding them deeper into the wilderness. Hours blurred into a single agonizing ordeal of cold and motion. The sun was a pale, impotent disk behind the thick clouds. Adeline's body ached with a deep, penetrating cold that settled into her bones. Her mind began to play tricks on her. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing shout. Every dark shape of a rock or a twisted pine looked like a rider. Just as dusk began to bleed its grey light into the snow, turning the world to shades of charcoal and indigo, Silas stumbled. He let out a pained whinny and went down on his foreleg. Adeline barely managed to throw herself and Thomas clear landing in a deep, soft drift. The horse struggled to its feet, but it wouldn't put weight on its front left leg. It was lame. A wave of utter despair washed over Adeline. They were stranded, alone. The wind howled its victory, and for the first time, she truly believed they were going to die out here, frozen and lost. She huddled with Thomas under the meager shelter of a snow-laden pine, pulling the heavy buffalo robe around them. Thomas was shivering, uncontrollably, his teeth chattering. "It's all right, my love," she whispered, her own voice cracking. "We'll rest a moment." But she knew rest was a death sentence. To stop moving was to freeze. As the last of the light failed, she saw him. A figure moving through the trees, as silent and grey as a wolf. Her heart stopped. Cain. She fumbled in the sack, her hand closing around the heavy stale loaf of bread, a pathetic weapon. The figure drew closer, and it was not Cain's stocky, arrogant swagger. This man moved with a fluid, ground-covering grace. It was Wanbley. Relief so powerful it buckled her knees, washed through her. He was on foot, carrying the rifle and a small pack. His face was a wreck, swollen and bruised, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He took in the scene at a glance, the lame horse, the shivering child, Adeline's terrified face. He didn't waste time on greetings or explanations. He knelt by Thomas, placing a hand on his back. "We must make fire. Shelter." With a decisiveness that bordered on magic, he created a sanctuary. He found a small rock outcropping that offered a slight break from the wind. Using a small hand axe from his pack, he cut pine boughs and wove them into a surprisingly effective windbreak. In the center, he cleared a space, and with a flint and steel and a piece of dry charcloth he produced from a leather pouch, he coaxed a tiny spark into a flame. He fed it tinder, then twigs, until a small, life-giving fire was crackling between them. He took the buffalo robe and draped it over the windbreak, creating a small enclosed space that trapped the heat. The temperature inside their makeshift shelter rose dramatically. The wind still shrieked outside, but inside there was only the hiss and pop of the fire. "Cain!" Adeline finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He is angry," Wanbley said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "He took his other horse, went to town for men. Brody, 2 others. They will look for a horse. For tracks, the snow is a blessing. It covers our path." He explained his plan in short, clipped sentences. He had let their horse go a mile back, sending it off in a different direction to create a false trail. He had circled back on foot, walking on rocks and wind-swept ground where he could to find them. He knew this land. It had once been his people's. He produced 2 smoked fish and a handful of dried berries from his pack. They ate in silence, the warmth of the food and the fire slowly chasing the chill from their bodies. Thomas, exhausted, fell asleep, almost immediately burrowed into Adeline's side. "Where are we going?" Adeline asked into the quiet darkness. Wanbley looked at her, his battered face illuminated by the firelight. For the first time, she saw not just a warrior or a survivor, but a man burdened by a deep and profound loneliness. "There is a place," he said, his voice low. "A hidden valley. My grandfather showed it to me when I was a boy. He called it Wingyan Owanka, the woman's place. It is sheltered from the wind. There is water, game, a place where a family could survive the winter." He paused. "It is a hard journey. 2 days, maybe 3, if the storm breaks." He didn't ask her if she wanted to go. He didn't need to. In his eyes, she saw the promise, not just of survival, but of something she had given up on, entirely a future. "Will we be safe there?" she asked. "No place is truly safe." He answered his honesty, a cold comfort. "But Cain will not find it. The snows will close the passes. By the time the spring thaw comes, we will be ghosts." They traveled for the next 2 days, a desperate, grueling journey. Wanbli led them through terrain that seemed impassable, teaching them as they went. He showed Adeline how to walk in snowshoes he fashioned from pine boughs and strips of leather. He showed her which lichens were edible, how to find clean water from snowmelt. He carried Thomas on his back. When the boy grew too tired, his stride never faltering. Adeline watched him, her admiration growing with every step. He was a part of this wilderness, not a conqueror of it like Cain. He understood its rhythms, its dangers, and its gifts. He moved through it with a quiet reverence, a man at home in a world that terrified others. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the snow finally stopped. The clouds parted, and a weak, watery sun illuminated a landscape of breathtaking, brutal beauty. They stood at the edge of a high ridge. Wanbli pointed downward. Below them, nestled between 3 towering, snow-dusted peaks, was a small valley. A ribbon of unfrozen water, steaming in the cold air, snaked through a thick forest of pine and aspen. It was protected, isolated, and utterly untouched. It was a promise cradled in the heart of the mountains. "Wingyan Owanka." Wanbli said, his voice soft with reverence. Adeline looked at the valley, then at the man beside her, and then at her son, who was staring with wide-eyed wonder. The fear that had been her constant companion for months finally began to recede. It was replaced by a new, fragile emotion, one she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The descent into the valley was arduous, but with every step downwards the air grew stiller, and the oppressive weight of the open plain seemed to lift. Down here the wind was a whisper, not a scream. The valley was a bowl of silence, holding the last light of the day, like a precious gift. Wanbli led them to a spot sheltered by a granite cliff face near the steaming creek. "We will build here," he announced. There was no if. There was only the quiet certainty of what must be done. The days that followed were the hardest and most meaningful of Adeline's life. Survival became a shared task, a silent dance of purpose. Under Wanbli's guidance, she discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. He was the architect and the teacher. She and Thomas were his apprentices. He taught her how to fell smaller pines with his hand axe, how to notch the logs so they would fit together. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and capable. He showed Thomas how to set simple snares for rabbits, and the boy's pride, when he caught his first one, was a sight that brought tears to Adeline's eyes. They worked from the first light of dawn until the last rays of sun faded from the mountain peaks. Their shelter began to take shape, not a house, not yet, but a sturdy 3-sided lean-to against the rock face. Wanbli used mud and moss from the creek bank to chink the gaps between the logs, creating a surprisingly solid wall against the elements. A fire pit in the center was kept constantly burning. In the evenings, they would huddle together under the buffalo robe, the firelight painting their faces. The silence between Adeline and Wanbli was no longer born of awkwardness or fear, but of a deep, companionable understanding. They were two solitary souls who had found an unlikely anchor in one another. Sometimes he would speak, telling Thomas stories of his people in his low, rumbling voice, tales of Iktomi, the spider trickster of the great thunderbird, of how the stars were scattered across the night sky. He was not just teaching the boy, he was reclaiming a part of himself that had been buried for years. Adeline found herself watching him, studying the lines of his face, the quiet strength in his hands, the profound sadness that still lingered in his eyes. This was the man Cain had called a savage, an animal. This gentle, patient teacher, this fierce protector, this heartbroken father. She realized the bargain she had made with Cain was not the true tragedy of her story. The tragedy was that she had ever believed men like Cain held the keys to survival, while men like Wanbley were invisible. One evening, as a thick, silent snow began to fall, blanketing their valley in fresh white, Adeline was mending a tear in Thomas's coat by the fire. Wanbley sat nearby, sharpening his knife on a smooth riverstone. "You never told me your full name," she said softly, the question emerging unbidden. He paused his work, looking into the flames. "My people called me Wanbley Scar." "Wanbley Scar," she repeated. "What does it mean?" "White eagle," he said. He looked at her, and his eyes held the vast, lonely expanse of the winter sky. "My father saw one born on the day I came into the world. He said it was a sign I would see things others could not." "He was right," she whispered. A rare, faint smile touched his lips. It transformed his battered face, hinting at the man he might have been before the world broke him. "Jedediah Cain gave me shelter. Food. I did his work. I survived," he said the words, costing him an effort. "But my spirit, it was starving. Here." He gestured around at their rough camp, at the falling snow, at the immense quiet wilderness. "It breathes again." Adeline looked from the rough-hewn logs of their shelter to the sleeping form of her son, his face peaceful in the firelight. She looked at Wanbley Scar, the white eagle, the man who had risked everything for them. She had gone to Jedediah Cain, seeking shelter, and found a prison. She had fled into the frozen wasteland, expecting death, and had found a home. It wasn't a home of glass windows and polished floors. It was a home built of necessity and resilience, of shared labor and unspoken respect. It was a place where a child could sleep safely, where a woman could reclaim her soul, and where a lonely warrior could finally, after so long, begin to heal. She reached out her fingers, gently touching the back of his hand. It was a simple, hesitant gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they had endured. He didn't pull away. He simply turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers. His skin was rough and warm. They sat there for a long time in the heart of the hidden valley, while the snow fell, covering their tracks, erasing their past and leaving only the promise of a future they would build together. And so, in a valley carved by time and blessed by silence, Adeline Hobbs and Wanbley Scar built more than a shelter. They built a life. She had offered herself for a roof over her head, a desperate bargain in the face of annihilation. But the lonely Lakota warrior, a man stripped of his people and his past, gave her something infinitely more precious. A home forged not of timber and mud, but of mutual respect, unyielding courage, and a love as quiet and powerful as the wilderness itself. Their story is a raw and potent testament to the resilience of the human heart in the harshest of lands, a reminder that true sanctuary is not a place you find, but something you build with another soul. If their harrowing journey from a gilded cage to a wild home moved you, please honor their memory by giving this video a like, sharing it with someone who appreciates a powerful, true-to-life story, and subscribing for more tales from the forgotten corners of the American frontier. Your support is what allows us to keep these vital histories alive. Thank you for listening.